Hello, welcome to the programme. We'd like you to get in touch to share your experience of care for people with learning disabilities or autism. Call us now, please. Ring 03 700 100 444. Today, 8 years on from a panorama programme that exposed criminal abuse at a hospital unit, another report describes appalling conditions for people held in isolation. One boy had lived for a year in a padded cell, naked under a blanket. What's your experience of care for people with learning disabilities or autism? Listeners have already been in touch. Anne is in Birmingham, and what she has to say is really disturbing.
My daughter doesn't actually have a learning disability, but she has been placed on a low secure unit, autistic unit for children with autism. And her mental health, she's been there since the end of January, and her mental health has deteriorated, where she is now not just self-harming, but she's actually mutilating her body.
I'm so sorry.
She's restrained. She is both physically and chemically. She's stripped naked and put into anti-rip clothing, put into an isolation cell. She's been held down in prone position. She's crying. She very rarely goes out. She has to have vitamin D supplements because of the lack of natural exposure to natural sunlight. Prior to going into this low secure unit, she had a life worth living, very educated, GCSEs, wanted to do the A-levels and join the RAF to be an EVAC doctor.
And what provoked your daughter's mental illness?
She was groomed by one of her former teachers at a school, and she developed a mental health illness from that, so she has quite complex PTSD. It started off as PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's become complex PTSD now because of the added trauma of being on these units.
And is there anything that you can do to get her out of the place where she is?
She's on a section. As a parent, I'm left powerless to help my child when they are being mistreated in these institutions. And Matt Hancock, who's Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, said that he was very concerned about the position that parents find ourselves in, the powerless position. There are things I want for my daughter. Such is her mental health now deteriorated. She cannot be discharged at the moment because she's so vulnerable now and such a high risk. What I want is to have a seamless transition for my daughter back to the community, to ask my daughter to have difficult conversations with us as a family. Where does my daughter want to go? Does she want to be discharged to home? Does she want a flat of her own? Does she want supported living? And how can we best achieve that? We have to think that these units don't have any modern technology for the children, no mobile phones, nothing. And so their access to the real world is really disorientated now.
Well, there's a call today for an independent review of every child and young person being held in England in segregation on mental health wards and specialist wards for people with learning disabilities and autism. What is your experience of care for people with learning disabilities or autism? Call us now, ring 03 700 100 444, or you can send messages by text to 84844. If you tweet, we're hashtag you and yours, or you can email us, youandyours@bbc.co.uk. We're talking about it all today because 2 reports this week have once again drawn attention to an appalling lack of adequate care for children and adults who have autism or learning disability. And our reporter, Carolyn Atkinson, can tell us more about it. Carolyn, tell us about today's report. What's in it?
Well, it's from the care regulator in England, the Care Quality Commission. It was ordered by the Health and Social Care Secretary after he heard the story of a girl with autism whose father broke a gagging order and revealed she'd been in long-term segregation for 2 years, fed through a hatch in the wall, and she wasn't allowed out. Now, this is part 1 of an 18-month-long investigation into restrictive interventions. And so far, the CQC has found more people in long-term segregation than even the hospitals knew about. They're held miles from home, so families can't visit easily. One was just 11 years old. The longest period of segregation for somebody was almost 10 years. And the report warns that some staff only get autism training online. It says too many staff are unqualified nursing and care assistants who may well care very well but are not trained. There are too few nurses and too many agency staff. And the CQC say 9 safety alerts were raised during these site visits, and they've concluded overall that the system is not fit for purpose.
Carolyn, the people with autism and learning disabilities who are held in long-term segregation have what is described as behaviours that challenge. Now, that is a really vague term. What does it really mean?
Well, if you talk to the Challenging Behaviour Foundation, they say it's a range of behaviours which some people use to communicate by in order to get their needs met because language itself is not effective. So, for example, hurting themselves by headbanging or biting or poking their own eyes, or hurting others by pulling hair or headbutting. And it can also be things like throwing things or eating inedible things like bedding or cigarette butts, and also spitting and smearing and rocking. Now, let me give you a very practical example from extremely well-trained staff who told me of a child who every time he was given a drink, he threw his cup across the room. The team tried to work out what this meant because it was a new thing, and they then realised that the position where the child sat to have his drinks had been changed and he couldn't see his carers. So once the staff moved back into his sight line, he could see them and it stopped. So it's about working out what communication means rather than saying, don't throw your cup.
Karen, how do people end up in these specialist units?
Well, this is something that the families and the CQC agree on. There's almost always a breakdown at home, a crisis, if you like, maybe because families are trying to deal with other children too, and meltdown begins. And everyone says it's because there are no local support systems to offer very immediate, very intensive help nearby. So the only option is to send someone off to an NHS or a privately run hospital, generally with a promise of a very short stay, but as we've heard, it can turn into months and even years, and very often hundreds of miles from home, and costing thousands of pounds per week.
Now, what should happen instead?
Well, the idea is that everyone should have a discharge plan showing how they will leave hospital. But this report is warning that many still don't, so they get stuck. And that's why one recommendation in today's report is to give everyone an advocate. But basically, if services were available locally, no one would end up being taken to these hospitals in the first place. And so many families would be spared all of this trauma.
Karen Atkinson, thank you. Call us, tell us your experience of care for children with learning disabilities or autism. Ring 03700 100 444. You can text us to 84844. If you tweet, it's hashtag you and yours, or you can email us, youandyours@bbc.co.uk. Now, we're having emails with lots of positive stories. This one, my daughter was an inpatient in a mental health ward where she stayed for 5 months. She had autism and restrictive eating disorder. The quietness, predictability and structure there provided a space out of home life and school life to build up her resilience and a more positive mental health that allowed a return to home and school a stronger person. Let's not give these places a sweeping generalisation and suggest that they don't have any place in our society. And this one from Angela Candy says her sister has severe learning difficulties, is in a residential care home. She can't praise the home enough. She says whenever she hears terrible stories of poor care, she thanks her lucky stars. Lizzie from Sheffield says some carers are doing a good job. She works to support young people with autism who live in the community, and she thinks that in Sheffield, where she lives, there's a really good service for people with autism. She says she's worked at the Steiner School there, and there is good provision in the community with after-school clubs and lots of other things. So just one more, Louise. Her 18-year-old daughter has severe autism and learning difficulties. Louise says when her daughter had a breakdown, she had great support from the local NHS Community Services team, and they stepped in and gave her support at home until she was well enough to go back to school. Well, let's go to our callers now. Tom is on the line. Tom, what is your experience then of care for people with autism and learning disability?
I came from industry and went to work in autism about 8-9 years ago at a custom-built care home, absolutely custom-built for autism and for learning difficulties. Training was excellent from a national charity, and for the first 3 years, our emphasis was on reducing the amount of cosh drugs which were being administered before these people came to before these autistic people came to the club. But what we treated them as what they were: 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and 40-year-old adults with a difficulty. And we worked on the difficulty. We did all it. We worked one-to-one. We had plenty of staff. They had outings. And within the space of a couple of years, we'd reduced the cosh medication down to almost zero. We were then taken over by a different care provider, and the number of staff was reduced by about 30%, and we reintroduced the cost drugs.
Why did that? Did that follow? Why does reducing the staff then mean that you end up using the tranquilising drugs?
Yeah, because we hadn't the time to do back to the one-to-one care, to the sitting to watch the movie with somebody that wanted to watch The Sound of Music for the 40th time, and you did that for them. And things, just the humdrum routine things which autistic people love. They like the routine part of it. The caller earlier said, sitting in the right position at a dining table. You have no idea how important that is to some autistic sufferers. And we didn't have the staff to do that. And consequently, I visited the place about 18 months ago, and we're back to square one. They're back with few staff. This training isn't as well because they can't afford the budget for training, and they're back to using the cost medication. I just think it's sad because we have the capacity of care amongst the population to help autism, to help people with learning difficulties, and we do not use it.
Tom, thank you. Kathy Sales is on the line. She is in Canterbury. Kathy, what's your experience of care for people with learning disability or autism?
I would absolutely agree with the previous caller that somebody who perhaps can't understand language, for example, my son is non-vocal, he can't talk at all, and so he understands his world with great difficulty, and it's very hard for him to relate to the world at all. And so in that position, if you can give structure to your world, things follow a logical pattern, you feel much calmer and you can avoid the need for... What happens is that when things are unpredictable, you get so-called behaviours being triggered. But actually, that's because perhaps somebody can't talk. And so the only way that they can let people know that something's wrong is by acting in a way that other people see as a problem, and then we'll try and drug them to stop them behaving in that way, which is actually their only way to say, well, I'm very upset, I don't understand. And so, in fact, care homes can be a very good thing, and I absolutely would like people to understand that there's a difference between Winterbourne, which was the scandal. That was not a care home. That was an assessment and treatment centre.
Yes, that is Winterbourne View, the home that Panorama visited in 2011 and did the secret filming.
And as a result, that home not only closed, but the whole chain, because all of these are owned by big business and generally are owned by equity companies. So they're a huge chain of multiple care homes.
Kathy, where is your son? Where is your son? Does he live still at home?
My son is 24 years old, and he lives in a care home, which I'm very pleased with because it's able to provide the structure that he needs, but at the same time, he hasn't got freedom of movement because he wouldn't be able to cope with it. So if he was if the front door was not locked, then he would go out and he would be hit by the first car. He doesn't have any kind of ability to look after himself. But at the same, and also at night he can't sleep and things like that. So they have people at night and during the day who are looking after him and other people like him in a very caring and lovely way, which is completely the opposite of these assessment and treatment centres.
We've had an email from a listener, Robert Rooney. He says his nephew was locked away for 5 weeks in what he calls horrible, frightening conditions in secure care. And he says...
And there was Connor Sparrowhawk who died completely unnecessarily in an assessment and treatment centre. So these are places that are set up to pick up the pieces when you're unable to give people the care that they need, and maybe just completely tranquilising them is not an option, or they haven't got that, and so people start freaking out in the community and so on because they're not given the care they need, and because you've closed down the special autistic centres that used to help them, and then they end up completely being uncontrollable and very upset. And then what happens is that they're put in place these private companies, assessment and treatment centres, chains, incredibly expensive, but the money is from the healthcare budget and not from social services budget, and that is the point.
Kathy, thanks.
As people are saying.
Thanks so much for calling. I'm only interrupting because we have many calls lined up now. We have Rose on the line. Rose, what is your experience of care for people with autism and learning disability?
Well, I have a friend who has a mental illness and also has autism, and she isn't locked up, thankfully, at the moment. She has been in the past, but she's living in the community, and she has something put a legal binding on her called a community treatment order, which means that she's injected with an anti-psychotic drug against her will every 2 weeks. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear. Does she have a psychotic illness? Your friend?
Yes, some people would say so, but the fact that what I'm phoning about is that there's a whole underclass of people. This is like a political thing, and for everybody whose liberty is deprived, whether it's in an assessment unit or in the community, it means that 2 doctors or 2 social workers have agreed that that should happen to that person. And it's like a willful blind spot, and especially when it comes down to what a previous caller referred to as the COSH drug. There's a psychiatrist called Dr. Joanna Moncrief, and she's exposed the effects these antipsychotic drugs have on people long term. They actually give people Parkinson's, and I'm watching my friend as the years go by. She's been enforced on her now 15 years, and her body is doubling over, and she can't control the movements of her legs. So her life is being trashed because 2 doctors somewhere or social workers have agreed to it, and she's voiceless. Even the legal team, that solicitor who come at her tribunal every few years, which she has to have, they can't shift. They just can't make any change. She's stuck
Rose,
in it. And
does she have an advocate? Because today's report calls for the people held in hospital wards and in units to have independent advocates. Does your friend have that? You're saying she goes to a tribunal periodically?
Every few years, yeah.
So I'm
in the past, she's had an IMCA, and I've seen other IMCAs in operation. But
what is an IMCA?
Because it's an independent mental, I'm not sure, but it's for people who have their liberty taken away.
It is an advocate, yes.
It's meant to be a safeguard, but in actual fact it doesn't work like that. And what I'm saying is there's an institutional establishment, NHS, set up who are complicit in ruining lots of people's lives, and it doesn't even get into the media because these people aren't seen as valuable. They're seen as an underclass.
Rose, thank you. Thank you very much for calling. Alexis is on the line. She's overseas. Alexis, what is your experience of care for people with mental disabilities and autism?
Well, I'm an autistic adult, and I spent 3.5 years in inpatient services after my brother died, and I had a baby. And as previous callers said, I went into crisis and I asked for help. And there wasn't any in the community at all for me and autism. So I ended up being detained under the Mental Health Act for 3.5 years, where I was subject to, different kinds of treatment. Yes, of course, there are excellent professionals out there, excellent doctors. But for the most part, and especially in private settings, assessment and treatment units, psychiatric intensive care units, I was forcibly drugged. I've actually written a book about it called Unbroken, and it details the whole thing. And, I was restrained 97 times, secluded 17 times.
Alexis, what effect did that have on you and on your mental health? Because it sounds to me like the absolute opposite of what you need. It's the opposite of a therapeutic environment.
That's right. I mean, my care cost, I estimate it at about 2.5 million. I was a teacher at the time, and all I really needed was some psychology in the community, some occupational therapy, and some speech and language, and someone just to help me set my routine, because I had a baby and my brother had just died. I needed that routine. But what actually happened is as soon as those doors to the ward shut, and I was transferred between 12 hospitals, in a cage, I encountered sensory overload, cognitive overload. I would melt down, and that's what led to the restraints, because there isn't the routine in a lot of places. I hear people that say, that they've had a good experience, or, that's good, but I've been in 12 hospitals, and I can honestly say that, only one of them actually helped me. And what happened in the end is that I actually had to escape, and I fled the country, which is why I am calling from overseas. Just to escape the section, because right now, I'm really traumatized, and that is why I've written my book, because At the end of the day, people need to know what's happening.
You say the section, that is the legal order where somebody can be kept in hospital against their will if it's for their own safety or the safety of others. So you had to walk away from a hospital to breach that section and move abroad.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, what happened is that, the hospital was actually making me worse. And I recognised, like parents do and like many people with autism and learning disabilities do, that they need help. Absolutely, I needed help. But I needed it in the community. I needed it in my environment. But nobody was kind of listening. So in the end, after 3.5 years, I'd just been sectioned for another 12 months. And they were going to escalate my service to a forensic one. I actually took the step to flee the country, and I travelled to France and then Dubai, and now I'm living overseas in Lagos. And what happened to me is, and after I escaped, within 6 weeks I came off 14 medications. And I was back teaching again. I'm actually a teacher, and I work in private international schools now overseas.
Alexis, thank you for getting in touch. Tina Jones has emailed really to support what you're saying. She says there's a fundamental failure in the care and health system for people who are autistic. Autism is not a mental illness. It doesn't necessarily feature any challenging or antisocial behaviour. And she says that when an autistic person is removed from abusive incarceration, often their problems disappear. Alexis, thanks very much for getting in touch. You can email us, youandyours at bbc.co.uk, text us to 84844, tweet #youandyours. This is Call You and Yours. Today we're talking about experiences of care for people with learning disabilities or autism. Ring us if you want to come live on air, 03700 100 444. Now, there is a call today for an independent review of every child and young person currently held in England in segregation on mental health wards and specialist wards for people with learning disabilities and autism. It's come from the regulator, the Care Quality Commission. It found patients held alone in rooms where all of their human interactions were with staff using force who are causing them distress. Today's report also says there is a shortage of staff with specialist training in autism, special needs and mental health. Anne Norman is an experienced nurse who is a specialist in learning disability nursing, and she talks about it for the Nurses Union, the Royal College of Nursing. And welcome to Call You and Yours.
Good afternoon.
What is your reaction then to today's report from the Care Quality Commission?
Well, as with many of the reports that we've seen in recent times, I can only say that it's completely distressing to hear the details. It's really important that these reports highlight the massive failings that are taking place right here every day and continue to not be responded to. People with learning disabilities and their care is just falling off the radar. And listening to some of your listeners' accounts, again, are really distressing to hear. Very difficult.
What do you think lies at the heart of this problem?
Well, it was interesting listening to one of your speakers about the correlation. There is a direct relationship between staffing and people's behaviour and their unmet needs. When you have good quality staffing levels and good quality care in place, the situation improves. And it was really encouraging to hear some people talking about their good experiences, which is really important that we know about that. When those positions are lost, when, for example, nursing jobs are lost, roles are not replaced, when people move on, then there's a direct consequence and a response, and that's when you notice the things like people having their medications increased, which is totally unacceptable. There are so many other options that we can supply. I think, from my point of view, nursing has a lot of the solutions to some of these challenges. This should never happen.
Well, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has promised to fix what he calls a broken care system for autism and learning disabilities. He's promised to do what the report asks, to review every patient in segregation. That will be done by independent specialists. He says there will be a new expert group developing an independent new care model. Will that be enough?
I would suggest not. I mean, it's a step in the right direction. From my point of view, again, it's not happening nearly quickly enough. Being concerned is not enough. We need action right now. And I'm staggered at how many times we've had to say this. We've spoken such a lot, talked to governments about, the nursing resource can really help to solve some of these problems. And our calls are being unheeded.
And Norman from the Royal College of Nursing, thank you for the minute. I will come back to you. You're listening to Call You and Yours. Today we're asking, what is your experience of care for people with learning disabilities or autism? Call us now, 03700 100 444. Alice Kemp did that. Alice, what's your experience?
Hi.
Hi.
Our son has complex physical learning disabilities and autism. And at 18, he moved into a supported living home with one other person because I have disabilities as well and was struggling to look after him. And we had huge hopes for it. It was a lovely house. He was living with a friend, and it very rapidly went downhill. The placement for the other person broke down. He ended up in a high care environment. We limped along for 2 years, and then a key member of staff left about a year ago, and the whole thing spiraled downhill very rapidly. Francis's occasional challenge behaviours became daily, and everybody started referring to him as a problem. He stopped being the loving young man that we all cared for, and everybody was seeing him as a problem. And having watched this happen with other friends, we knew that where he would end up would be in some sort of secure unit, and we didn't want that. We had a different vision for him. We've also had a fantastic social worker, which made a huge difference. And we fought back, and 7 weeks ago he moved into a residential home where the care is much more consistent, and it's just transformed him. But there were whole issues around the way staff were trained and the way staff were supervised. Francis's favourite phrase is no tar. So if you ask him any question, he will always just say no.
Say no, yes.
It's something he really, really wants. But staff would ask him, do you want to go out? And they said no, tar. So they would just let him sit on the sofa all day.
Do you think because that was easier for them?
Yeah, but I think it was also they just weren't trained and they weren't supported. There's so little money in the care system. When I think supported living, there's so little oversight. Residential care is managed because the CQC go into the houses and inspect them, whereas with supported living, it's only the office of the care agency that gets inspected.
Alice, we just had an anonymous text. This person says, my son is 12, he has learning difficulties, and we have been in CAMS, that is Child and Adult Mental Health Services, since he was 2. He's aggressive and anxious, and the NHS has no service to help. I know we are living with a time bomb, just waiting for the next crisis with no help or support. As a family, we are broken. We feel helpless. What would you say to that person?
I'm so sorry. And I used to be a teacher of young people like him and like my son before I had my own. And it just breaks my heart because actually there are a tiny number of people, I suspect, that we will never be able to get to the bottom of what's causing the distress. But oftentimes it's just a lack of time and money for people to have an expertise, for people to really try and understand what the cause of that behaviour is, how that young person can communicate their wishes with the world. And then my son was very challenging when he was young. He had no language, and because I was a PECS, which is a picture exchange communication system trained person, we trained up a friend and we taught him to speak because the school weren't doing it at the time.
You had to do it yourself.
Yeah, but that was transformative because it meant that he could then start to communicate his wishes with people.
Alice, well done. Thank you for calling.
I'm so sorry for her place where they are with their family because I really feel for them.
Thank you. We have another caller on the line, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, what's your experience then of care for people with learning disabilities and autism?
My experience started when my daughter was about 20 years old and she is now 30. And as a young adult, went into crisis. And so she has been in and out of different care homes, and she's also been in supported living. I would agree with your earlier carer that in supported living, it's very easy for them to be forgotten because they are not adequately overseen, and there isn't the inspection procedure that there is with the CQC. I felt when she was in supported living that carers were inexperienced, they didn't know what to do, they couldn't cope with crises. She was deteriorating terribly in supported living, but also in care homes where there was a similar sort of what I call carer chaos, with a constant turnover of different carers because they simply can't cope. So they put someone else in. So the myth of consistency of care is a myth. In our experience, we haven't yet had that. And as a result, our daughter has lost her use of her living skills, the use of language as she used to be able to speak. And she has been contained, kept indoors, because if she went outdoors, she might become aggressive, violent, run away, strip her clothes off, be incontinent in a public place. Behaviours we never experienced in the first 20 years of her life. It's been desperate to see her deterioration.
Maria, just hold on there, because we have another caller on who has worked with people with mental health problems in prisons, at home and in health units, and wants to talk about how difficult it is for the workers. Can you tell me the points that you wanted to make then, your experience of caring for people with complex mental disabilities and autism? Do we have that caller? Do we have that other caller there?
Sorry, I'm Maria.
Hi, yes.
Yes, I'm here.
I think we've got two Marias on the line. Yeah, we've got a Maria who has worked in the sector. Tell us, Maria who's worked in the sector, tell us what your experience is.
I just know that having worked in prisons, hospitals, locked units, how difficult it is for the staff. And sometimes patients must be isolated or sedated for their safety and other patients. I feel strongly that many staff are maligned badly. These children can't be held at home. That's why they're in units. Teachers are being hurt daily. A friend of mine has just been kicked in the head by a 4-year-old who cannot be controlled. I've treated patients in all those units, and I would hate to be employed full-time caring for them. It's the unpredictability of many of these children and patients that's a constant worry and fear for staff. And it's just too easy for people who never experience being with these people to criticise those who care for them. And I feel that's putting the other side for all the carers.
Okay, the other Maria, who's a parent, I don't want to set you up against each other, but what would you say to that that most people have no idea how difficult this work is?
I would say that there have been times when I've certainly felt these often young people, inexperienced people, should not be working with my daughter because they don't have the training and the skills. Now, as a parent, I can't influence that. That's to do with the commissioning by the local authority or health. And that does need to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. I think if the appropriately skilled carers are in place, the risk to carers can be minimised. The risk to the vulnerable person can also be minimised, because once you put a vulnerable person with very difficult and challenging and unpredictable behaviour in the hands of inexperienced people, you are in a very dangerous situation, and everybody, including the public, are at risk. So it's a valid point.
And Maria, I'll leave it there. Just want to get one more caller in from Falkirk in Scotland. This is Jeanette. Jeanette, what's your experience of care for people with autism and learning disability?
It's regarding my grandson. My grandson is age 29. He has a condition known as Fragile X with severe autism combined. He was at home until he was 16, and then he went into, because of the home circumstances and being unable to cope, he went to the National Autistic Society, and he was a resident there in Ayrshire until 4 years ago. He now has been placed in his community with 24-hour care in his own flat, and I just wanted to praise the care that he's had. We've had a very positive experience. I'm so sad to hear some people's experiences. It must be horrendous, because it's someone you love dearly and you hear they are being treated badly, and you also feel guilty because you are unable to do it yourself. You need someone else to help. And I really wanted to praise the care that Stephen has had. He now has 24-hour care. He cannot do very much on his own, but we know that he's well cared for. He's within our own community, so he's visited regularly. And great praise to a super social worker and a local authority for what they've done.
Jeanette, thank you for getting in touch. Lots of activity on Twitter about this story. Alensky says independent mental health advocates, that is what is recommended in today's report, are blocked when they raise concerns. The NHS mental health system is not fit for purpose. This one, Charlie, again on Twitter, good quality care relies on more than training. Common sense and empathy are the key to it. Think how you would behave in that situation. People are people, they're not labels. Let's stop living in the dark ages. Anastasia, again on Twitter, too many people with learning disabilities are being dumped in inadequate and inappropriate institutions. I have cerebral palsy, I use an electric wheelchair. All of this is nothing new. It has been happening to people for years. This one, Unicom, again on Twitter, just listening to stories of the shocking state of care for adults with learning disability or autism and challenging behaviours. Please, can we stop wasting time and money on Brexit and redirect our energy to more important problems? Well, we're running out of time. We've had a lot of calls and messages about this today, and listeners have been emailing us hours before we came on air. Claire did that, and I spoke to her earlier this morning. Claire's son is severely autistic, hyperactive. He has a learning disability. He's now in a special residential school. It's 150 miles from his home. And she told me about the quality of care that he has had since he was small.
It's been very, very varied. He was diagnosed eventually before he was 4, and you sort of start the process thinking, that's it, we've got the diagnosis, and it's all going to be supportive from now on. And it's really varied from school to school and according to how much you as parents push to receive service.
Tell me about his behaviour.
So he's 14 now. He's a bright, happy young man, but when we reached the crisis point for a couple of years, he had changed considerably. The very upset, lost, solitary young man with anger issues, and at the worst point, wouldn't even leave the house for his favourite provider of sausage rolls in the high street, which was one of his favourite things to do. So the change in him was very great.
What did you want at that point for him, and what did you get?
We tried very hard to get a full intensive service, and we had an excellent children with disability social worker who supported us in that, but we just didn't get anywhere. We were told repeatedly, well, you're in a crisis situation with his behaviour and his problems and his mental health, but you're not crisis enough, so you don't qualify for this next service. So we had some, what I would call in inverted commas, basic support from a service, but no psychology intervention or speech therapy or really intensive therapeutic intervention, which is what he was really needing.
And you would have liked that for him at home?
Oh, desperately. And I'm an ex-teacher, so I have a general understanding of things.
How difficult a decision was it then to allow him to go to a special residential school?
It was absolutely heartbreaking. It was something we'd always thought before 21 for him to have a level of, in inverted commas, independence from us. But to do it when he was 12, nearly 13, was not something we had considered. So we just agreed to look at first, and our main decision in the end was we found somewhere we felt was the right fit for him, but we also didn't want him suddenly removed from the home without our control of where he went. That frightened us greatly, the thought of that happening.
And how is he doing since he moved to that residential school?
It continues to be a roller coaster for us. I think you learn to accept, but it doesn't necessarily get easier. But he is showing us the way. He has made amazing progress. He's back to the happy, laughing. He loves to laugh. He laughs so much till he can't breathe. He's back to that lovely lad that we always had, and he comes home regularly for some home sleeps. And, yeah, it's our son again. It is our son again.
That's Claire speaking to me this morning. And Norman from the Royal College of Nursing. People do know how to do good care, don't they? But you have to be able to find it for yourself, don't you? And often it isn't local, as in Claire's case.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing this afternoon is that there's huge variability around the country, and we absolutely have to iron out some of that variability. Good care versus bad care. It's staggering to hear that people aren't demonstrating crisis enough. Crisis needs to be, it's the end point. We need to respond much earlier when people are displaying behaviours that challenge, and that is an interesting term, isn't it? People display those behaviours when they're in distress, and that's telling us somebody needs some help and support, and it's just simply not there.
And Norman from the Royal College of Nursing, thank you for being our expert guest today. And thanks to everyone who got in touch. There'll be another phone-in on a different subject next Tuesday. This text has just come through. I have heard many times that the true measure of humanity and of a good society is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. I can only conclude we're losing our humanity bit by bit. And this is linked directly to inequality and the pursuit of status. That's it for today. On tomorrow's programme, Charival in a journey that takes her to a Bavarian monastery, luxury flats built by the Nazis. Find out tomorrow, 12:15.